Born the son of an archduke, the innocent child of the couple whose death ignited the First World War. Yet fate stripped him of his right to the throne before he even took his first breath. He had no empire to lose, yet he lost everything else: his parents, his childhood, and his freedom. Instead of a life of royal privilege, he was thrown into the filth of the Dachau concentration camp. He survived the liberation, but his body was shattered by years of hard labor, leading to his death at just 49, the final agonizing consequence of his imprisonment. His name was Prince Ernst Hohenberg. How did the Orphan of Sarajevo, the boy who lost his parents to the bullet that opened the century, become the honorary prisoner most brutally tormented by the Nazis? To feel the crushing weight of Ernst's destiny, do not start with the gunshot. We must go back to the marriage contract of 1900 that stole his crown from the very beginning, and witness the courage of a prince who dared to openly defy Hitler, paying the price with his own withering life. The Austro-Hungarian Empire at the turn of the century was a place of suffocating grandeur. It was an empire of waltzes and coffee houses, of gold braid and polished sabers, but underneath the surface it was rotting. It was held together by one man, the Emperor Franz Joseph. By the time Ernst was born, the emperor was an old man, a living fossil who had ruled since 1848. He was a bureaucrat king, obsessed with protocol, duty, and the divine right of his bloodline. To Franz Joseph, the Habsburg dynasty was not just a family, it was a sacred institution, and its purity had to be protected at all costs. Into this rigid, frozen world stepped Ernst's father, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. History has been unkind to Franz Ferdinand. We often picture him as a stiff mustache-twirling villain, a symbol of the oppressive old world. And true, in public, he could be prickly, reactionary, and short-tempered. He was a man who shot tigers in India and stags in the forests of Austria by the thousands, a man who seemed to lack the common touch. But there was another side to him, a side that the public never saw, and a side that would define Ernst's entire existence. Franz Ferdinand was a man capable of a deep, consuming love. In the mid-1890s, the Archduke did the unthinkable. He fell in love with a woman who was not a princess. Her name was Countess Sophie Chotek. Now, to you and me, a countess sounds grand enough. She came from an ancient Bohemian noble family, the Choteks of Dachau and Wagnin. Her ancestors had served the Habsburgs for centuries. But in the eyes of the stiff, fossilized court of Vienna, Sophie was a nobody. She was not ebenbürtig, of equal birth. She was a lady-in-waiting, a servant to the true royals. For the heir to the throne to marry a lady-in-waiting was not just a scandal. It was a constitutional crisis. It was seen as a pollution of the Habsburg blood. The conflict that followed was brutal. For years, Franz Ferdinand fought his uncle, the emperor, for the right to marry Sophie. The court turned against him. The newspapers whispered. The family pressured him to find a nice German princess with the correct pedigree. But Franz Ferdinand, stubborn and furious, refused. He told them, "I will marry Sophie, or I will never marry at all." He was willing to burn the dynasty's future to the ground for the sake of this woman. Finally, the emperor relented, but he exacted a terrible price, a price that would fall squarely on the shoulders of their unborn children. On June 28, 1900, exactly 14 years to the day before his death, Franz Ferdinand stood in the secret council chamber of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. Surrounded by the highest archdukes and ministers, he had to swear a humiliating oath on the crucifix. He had to agree to a morganatic marriage. This meant that while Sophie would be his wife, she would never be empress. And most devastatingly, Their future children would be barred from the line of succession. They would have no claim to the throne. They would not be archdukes of Austria. They would be stripped of the imperial rights that should have been their birthright. It was into this atmosphere of legalized rejection that Ernst was born on May 27th, 1904. He was the couple's second son. His older sister, Sophie, had been born in 1901, and his brother, Maximilian, in 1902. When Ernst arrived, the family was complete. But from the moment he drew his first breath, his life was defined by what he was not. In the eyes of the law, he was not a Habsburg. The Emperor Franz Joseph refused to grant the children the family name. Instead, they were given the title von Hohenberg, a consolation prize, a name taken from a minor title, invented to keep them in their place. Imagine growing up with that knowledge. Ernst was the grandson of the brother of the emperor. His father was the next emperor. And yet Ernst was a non-person at court. When the family visited the imperial palaces, the strict Spanish court etiquette governed every move. At official dinners, his mother, Sophie, was not allowed to sit beside her husband. She had to walk at the very end of the procession, behind the youngest, silliest teenage archduchesses, simply because they had royal blood, and she did not. Ernst and his siblings watched this humiliation daily. They saw their mother, a woman of dignity and grace, treated like a pariah by their own relatives. This exclusion, however, had an unintended, beautiful side effect. It drove the family closer together. Because they were shunned by Vienna, they created their own world. They retreated to Konopishti Castle, a massive fairy tale fortress in Bohemia. If you were to visit Konopishti in those golden years before 1914, you would have seen a scene that baffled the rigid courtiers of Vienna. You would have seen the terrifying Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man the world feared, rolling on the floor with his children. You would have seen him giving Ernst piggyback rides through the rose gardens. Franz Ferdinand was obsessed with roses. He planted thousands of them at Konopishti, creating a fragrant sanctuary for his unsuitable family. Ernst's childhood was idyllic, almost magically so. The castle was filled with the latest technology. Franz Ferdinand loved gadgets, so they had electricity, hydraulic lifts, and modern plumbing, luxuries that even the emperor's palace in Vienna lacked. They lived in a bubble of warmth. The children were known as the Hohenbergs, and they were the center of their parents' universe. Surviving letters and diaries from this time paint a picture of Ernst as a sensitive, intelligent boy. He was quieter than his boisterous older brother Max. He had a gentle nature, perhaps inherited from his mother. He adored animals and spent hours in the vast parklands of the estate. The bond between the siblings, Sophie, Max, and Ernst, was forged in iron. They knew they were different. They knew the rest of the family looked down on them. Max, as the eldest son, was the Duke, and Ernst was the Prince. But these titles felt hollow when they visited Vienna and were ignored by their grandfather, the Emperor. There is a poignant story that illustrates the confusing world Ernst lived in. Once, the children were brought to see the Emperor Franz Joseph. The old man, stiff in his uniform, looked at the three little Hohenbergs. He didn't bounce them on his knee. He didn't offer them sweets. He looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, viewing them not as his great-nephews and niece, but as living proof of his nephew's disobedience. Ernst, even at a young age, must have felt that chill. He learned early on that love was found at home in the rose gardens of Konopishti, not in the marble halls of power. But the outside world was creeping in. The political tensions of Europe were tightening like a noose. Franz Ferdinand knew, perhaps better than anyone, that the empire was crumbling. He had plans. He dreamed of modernizing the empire, of giving more rights to the Slavic peoples, of breaking the stranglehold of the Hungarian nobility. He wanted to create a United States of Greater Austria. He was working tirelessly to ensure that when he inherited the throne, he could save the monarchy. And what of Ernst's future? Franz Ferdinand knew his son would never be emperor. So he tried to build a different inheritance for him. He poured his personal wealth into buying estates and land, ensuring that even if the state stripped them of titles, his boys would be wealthy, independent gentlemen. He wanted Ernst to be safe. He wanted him to be free of the toxic politics of Vienna. By 1914, Ernst was 10 years old. He was old enough to understand that his father was an important man, a man who commanded armies and fleets. He was old enough to notice the security guards that constantly shadowed them. He was old enough to hear the word assassination whispered by adults, though he couldn't fully grasp its reality. The Balkans were a powder keg, and his father was the man sitting on top of it. The spring of 1914 was beautiful at Konopiszte. The roses were in full bloom. The family spent their days together, unaware that the clock was ticking down the final seconds of their happiness. In June, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II visited the castle. It was a grand affair full of hunting and feasting. Ernst and his siblings were presented to the Kaiser, who was charmed by their good manners. It was the last time the family would host such a gathering, the last time the bubble would feel secure. Then came the decision that would doom them, the decision to go to Sarajevo. It is important to understand why they went. Franz Ferdinand was Inspector General of the Armed Forces, and he had to attend military maneuvers in Bosnia. But there was another reason, a personal reason that tugged at his heart. The visit was scheduled for June 28th, their 14th wedding anniversary. In Vienna, court protocol dictated that Sophie could not ride in the same carriage as her husband on official occasions. She could not sit at the head table. She was always pushed to the side. But in Sarajevo was different. It was a provincial capital, far from the stifling rules of the Viennese court. There, the rigid etiquette was relaxed. The Archduke realized that in Sarajevo, on their anniversary, he could ride through the city with his wife beside him, openly, proudly, as an equal. He could give her the public honor she had been denied for 14 years. They went to their deaths for the sake of a romantic gesture. They went so they could sit side by side. The departure from Konopiszte was emotional. The children were to stay behind. It was just a short trip, a few days. They would be back soon. There are reports that Franz Ferdinand had a bad feeling about the trip. The electricity in the air was heavy. He told his children to be good, to study hard, and that he would bring them gifts upon his return. Ernst watched the cars pull away down the long driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. He waved goodbye to his mother and father. He watched them disappear around the bend. He would never see them again. The days that followed at Konopiszte were quiet. It was the height of summer. The gardens were lush, the air filled with the buzzing of bees and the scent of the thousands of roses his father loved so dearly. Ernst, Max, and Sophie played, attended their lessons, and waited. Sunday, June 28th, dawned hot and clear. In Sarajevo, the crowds were gathering. In Konopiszte, the children went to Mass in the castle chapel. At around 11 a.m., the telegram arrived at the castle. Communication in 1914 was not instant, but bad news travels with a speed that defies technology. The initial reports were confused. There had been a bomb. The Archduke was hurt. Then, silence. Then, the second telegram, the one that confirmed the worst. The staff at Konopiszte were thrown into chaos. How do you tell 3 children that their world has ended? How do you look a 10-year-old boy in the eye and tell him that his father and mother have been murdered by a fanatic in a city he has never seen? The task fell to their tutors and the household staff. The atmosphere in the castle shifted instantly from a sunny Sunday to a house of mourning. The blinds were drawn. The servants wept openly in the corridors. When Ernst was told, the shock must have been absolute. At 10, death is a concept you understand. But murder? Political assassination? These are horrors that no child should have to process. They weren't just dead. They had been taken, stolen. But the personal tragedy of losing his parents was immediately compounded by the political machinery of the empire. The children were now orphans, yes, but they were also political problems. With Franz Ferdinand dead, the new heir to the throne was the Archduke Charles, their cousin. Ernst and his siblings were now completely irrelevant to the future of the monarchy. The protection their father had provided, the wall of money and influence he had built around them, began to crumble instantly. The bodies of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were brought back to Austria, and here the cruelty of the court reached its peak. You might expect that the empire would mourn its fallen heir with dignity. You would be wrong. The Chamberlain, Prince Montenuovo, the man who had spent years trying to sabotage Sophie's social standing, decided to pursue his vendetta even beyond the grave. He organized a funeral that was designed to insult the memory of the couple. He tried to prevent the bodies from even lying in state. When he was forced to allow it, he placed Sophie's coffin on a lower plinth than her husband's to show that she was of lower rank. He placed the gloves and fan of a lady-in-waiting on her coffin, a final petty reminder that she had once been a servant. The funeral procession was not allowed to take place in the daylight. It was held at night, a hurried, almost secretive affair through the streets of Vienna. The Emperor Franz Joseph did not even attend the main funeral mass, and there, amidst this display of cold imperial protocol, stood Ernst, Max, and Sophie, 3 small figures in black. They were the only ones truly mourning. The court was buzzing with whispers, some even saying it was a relief that the problem of Franz Ferdinand was gone. The children stood alone against the weight of an empire that didn't want them. Ernst was 10 years old, standing before the mismatched coffins of his parents, inhaling the incense and the dust of the ancient church. He looked at the faces of his relatives, the archdukes, the princes, the generals, and saw no warmth, only calculation. He realized then, perhaps for the first time, that he was truly on his own. The roses of Konopishte were far away. The cold wind of the 20th century was blowing, and it was about to turn into a hurricane. The calculated cruelty extended even to the guest list. Foreign kings and princes who wanted to come to Vienna to pay their respects were explicitly told to stay away. The emperor claimed he was too old and frail to host them, but everyone knew the truth. He refused to honor the woman his nephew had dared to love. Ultimately, the couple was even denied a place in the imperial crypt in Vienna, where Habsburg rulers had rested for centuries. Instead, they were banished to Archstetten Castle, a smaller family estate. As the heavy doors of the crypt closed, the doors of the imperial world also slammed shut for the children. The message was clear: you are not one of us. The 3 orphans were placed under the guardianship of their mother's close friend and their step-grandmother, Archduchess Maria Theresa. She was one of the few Habsburgs who had shown them kindness, but even her love could not protect them from the collapse that was coming. War broke out. The Great War. The war that everyone said would be over by Christmas. For Ernst, the war was a strange, distant thunder. He was the son of the man whose death had started it all, yet he was pushed to the sidelines. While his cousins, the real archdukes, were given honorary military ranks and paraded in uniforms, Ernst and his brother Max were kept in the shadows. They were living symbols of the tragedy, inconvenient reminders of the empire's failure. Life at home changed drastically. The staff disappeared, drafted to the front. The luxury of Konopishtia began to fade. Food became scarce as the British naval blockade strangled the Central Powers. The heating was turned down. The gilded cage was becoming a cold, hollow shell. In 1916, the old Emperor Franz Joseph finally died. He had ruled for 68 years. With his death, the last anchor of the old world was gone. Ernst's cousin, Archduke Karl, became the new emperor. Karl was a good man, a friend of Ernst's father, and for a brief moment, there was hope. Karl treated the Hohenberg children with kindness. He restored some of their titles and tried to bring them back into the fold, but it was too late. The empire was already terminally ill. The hunger riots had started in Vienna. The armies were breaking on the Italian front. The United States of Greater Austria that Ernst's father had dreamed of was dissolving into chaos. Then came 1918, the end of the world. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't just lose the war, it ceased to exist. It shattered like a dropped mirror. New nations sprang up from the ruins. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary. Austria was reduced to a small shivering rump state, a head without a body. For the Habsburgs, this was the apocalypse. The new Republican government in Austria passed the Habsburg Law, which dethroned the dynasty and banished them from the country unless they renounced their claims to the throne and lived as private citizens. The imperial family, Emperor Karl, Empress Zita, and their children were forced into exile. They left via train, heading into the unknown, leaving behind palaces that had been theirs for 600 years. But here's the cruel legal twist that trapped Ernst. The new Austrian Republic looked at Ernst and Max and said, "You are not Habsburgs." Because of their father's morganatic marriage, they had no claim to the throne. Therefore, the Habsburg law of exile did not apply to them. They were allowed to stay in Austria. They were not kicked out. However, across the border in the newly formed Czechoslovakia, the government took a different view. The new Czech state looked at the vast estates of Konopishtia and Chlum, Ernst's childhood homes, his inheritance, his sanctuary, and said these belonged to the Habsburgs. They classified Ernst and his siblings as members of the former imperial house for the sole purpose of confiscating their property. It was a catch-22 of breathtaking cynicism. In Austria, they were commoners to be tolerated. In Czechoslovakia, they were royals to be stripped. On April 16, 1919, the Czechoslovak National Assembly passed a law seizing the landed property of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine without compensation. Konopishtia, the castle where Franz Ferdinand had rolled on the floor with his sons, where he had planted his thousands of roses, where the family had spent their last happy days, was taken by the state. The personal possessions, the furniture, the art, the library, even the family photos, were seized. Ernst was 15 years old. In the span of 5 years, he had lost his father, his mother, his status, his country, and now his home. The wealth that Franz Ferdinand had so carefully accumulated to protect his unsuitable children was largely gone, swallowed by the ravenous new borders of Europe. The family moved to Vienna, to the Hohenberg Palace on the Riesnerstrasse. It sounds grand, but post-war Vienna was a city of ghosts and starvation. The inflation was rampant. Money became worthless paper. Aristocrats were selling their jewelry for sacks of potatoes. The streets were filled with wounded veterans, begging in their tattered uniforms, the same uniforms Ernst's father had inspected. It was in this fractured, desperate world that Ernst entered adulthood. He finished his education at the Schotten Gymnasium, a prestigious school in Vienna. He was a good student, quiet and serious. He lacked the arrogance of the old aristocracy. How could he have it? He had seen how fragile power really was. He studied law at the University of Vienna, grounding himself in the rules of a society that seemed to have none. As the 1920s roared, or rather whimpered, in Austria, Ernst and Max began to define their own identities. They were young men with a famous name but no clear role. They were princes, but in a republic that despised titles. Ernst developed a deep, melancholic patriotism. He loved Austria, not the new shrinking republic that was struggling to pay its bills, but the idea of Austria. He was a devout Catholic, deeply influenced by the tragedy of his parents. He believed in the old values, duty, service, faith. He saw the chaos of the 1920s, the street fights between the communists and the fascists, the poverty, the moral decay as a result of the collapse of the old order. And he was not alone. In the coffee houses of Vienna, there was a growing movement of legitimists, people who wanted to restore the Habsburg monarchy. They believed that the only way to save Austria from being swallowed by Germany or taken over by the Bolsheviks was to bring back the emperor. Ernst and Max became key figures in this movement. It was dangerous work. The Social Democrats who ran Red Vienna hated the monarchists. But the brothers were driven by a sense of history. They felt they owed it to their father's memory to defend the independence of Austria. In the midst of this political turmoil, Ernst found a personal anchor. He fell in love. In 1936, he married Marie-Thérèse Wood. She was a British citizen, the daughter of Captain George Jervis Wood and a Hungarian countess. It was a love match, much like his parents. She was a woman of spirit and strength, and she would need every ounce of it in the years to come. They had children, and for a brief period, Ernst experienced a shadow of the domestic happiness he had known at Konopiszce. He was a devoted father, gentle and protective. He tried to shield his own children from the weight of the past, just as Franz Ferdinand had tried to shield him, but the tectonic plates of history were shifting again. To the north, in Germany, a new power had risen. Adolf Hitler had become chancellor in 1933. The relationship between the Nazis and the Habsburgs is a fascinating and often misunderstood chapter of history. You might assume that the Nazis, being right-wing authoritarians, would have natural allies in the old aristocracy. But Hitler loathed the Habsburgs with a passion that bordered on obsession. To Hitler, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been an abomination. It was a Völkerkerker, a prison of nations. But worse, it was a chaotic mix of races and cultures. Hitler, who had lived in Vienna as a failed artist before the war, hated the city's cosmopolitanism. He hated the way the emperor had ruled over Jews, Slavs, Hungarians, and Germans as equals under the crown. He viewed the Habsburg dynasty as un-German, a weak, degenerate family that had polluted the pure German blood by mixing with other nationalities. And who were the living embodiments of this pollution? Ernst and Max. They were the sons of the Archduke who had wanted to give the Slavs equal rights. They were devout Catholics who despised the pagan, violent ideology of the Nazis. As the pressure from Nazi Germany grew in the late 1930s, the Anschluss, the unification of Austria and Germany, became the central question of the day. The Nazis in Austria began a campaign of terror, bombing public buildings and assassinating officials. Ernst and Max did not stay silent. This is the part of the story that earns them the title of heroes. In a time when many aristocrats were quietly making deals with the Nazis to save their estates or Fleeing to London and Switzerland, the Hohenberg brothers stood their ground. They publicly supported the Austro-fascist government of Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss and later Kurt Schuschnigg, not because they were perfect Democrats, but because they were the only barrier against Hitler. They attended rallies for Austrian independence. They spoke to monarchist groups, urging them to resist the German pull. They knew they were being watched. The Gestapo had files on them. They were marked men. Imagine the courage that took. Ernst was a man who had already lost everything once. He had a wife and young children. He could have fled. He had British connections through his wife. He could have gone to England, lived a quiet life in the countryside, and written memoirs. But he stayed. He stayed because he believed that a Hohenberg did not run. He stayed because he believed Austria was a spiritual entity that had to be defended against the barbarianism of the swastika. The tension in Vienna in early 1938 was palpable. It was the calm before the storm. The cafes were full of whispers. Is Hitler coming? Will the West stop him? Should we pack our bags? On March 11, 1938, the dam broke. Under threat of immediate invasion, the Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg resigned. He announced over the radio, in a voice breaking with emotion, "God save Austria." That night, the German Wehrmacht crossed the border. There was no resistance. Instead, they were met with cheering crowds throwing flowers. It was a delirious, terrifying national suicide. The next day, Hitler entered Vienna in triumph. He stood on the balcony of the Hofburg, the very palace where Ernst's grandfather had ruled, and proclaimed the end of Austria. It was now just Ostmark, a province of the German Reich. For the Jews of Vienna, the terror began instantly. Shops were smashed, people were beaten in the streets, and the first transports to the camps were organized, but the Nazis also had a special list of political enemies they wanted to neutralize immediately. They wanted to decapitate the Austrian opposition. They wanted to destroy the symbols of the old Austria. Ernst and Max were at the top of that list. Friends urged them to flee in those chaotic final hours before the borders were sealed. Go to Switzerland, they begged. Go to Hungary. But the brothers refused. Perhaps they were naive. Perhaps they thought their name still held some magical protection, that even the Nazis wouldn't dare touch the children of Franz Ferdinand. Or perhaps they simply refused to be intimidated by the Bohemian corporal, as the old aristocracy called Hitler. They were at home in Vienna when the end of their freedom arrived. It wasn't a dramatic military siege. It was a knock on the door, the banality of evil. The Gestapo agents who arrested them were likely Austrian Nazis, men who perhaps had cheered for their father 20 years earlier, now wearing the swastika armband. The date was March 14th, 1938, just 2 days after the Anschluss. The speed of the arrest shows just how much of a threat the Nazis considered them. They weren't arrested for a specific crime. They were arrested for who they were. They were arrested for representing an idea, the idea of an Austria that was Catholic, multinational, and independent. Ernst was taken from his family. He kissed his wife goodbye, not knowing if he would see her again. He was taken to the police headquarters at the Hotel Metropole, which had been commandeered by the Gestapo. There, the processing began. The shouting, the stripping of possessions, the dehumanization. He was no longer Prince Ernst of Hohenberg. He was a Schutzhäftling, a protective custody prisoner, a political enemy of the Reich. From the holding cells of Vienna, the brothers were put on one of the first transports out of the country. They were not heading to a normal prison. They were heading to a place that was technically on German soil, a place near Munich that had been established 5 years earlier to hold the enemies of the state. The train rattled through the countryside. Through the windows, Ernst could see the spring fields of the land that was no longer Austria. He must have thought of his parents. He must have thought of the strange, bloody arc of his life. His father's death had opened the door to the chaos of the 20th century, and now that chaos was swallowing the sun. The train slowed. The brakes screeched. They had arrived at the station. The doors opened, and the SS guards were waiting with dogs and truncheons. The air was cold. The sign on the gate ahead read Dachau. Dachau in 1938 was not yet the mass extermination factory that places like Auschwitz would become later in the war. It was something perhaps even more sinister in its psychological design. It was a school of violence. It was a model camp designed to break the human spirit through a scientifically calibrated regimen of terror, exhaustion, and humiliation. For Ernst and Max, the transition from the gentle, albeit faded aristocracy of Vienna to the mud and barbed wire of Bavaria was absolute. The processing of a new prisoner was a ritual designed to strip away every layer of individuality. When the Hohenberg brothers stepped off the trucks and were marched through the Urhaus gate, underneath that infamous iron slogan, Arbeit macht frei, they ceased to be princes. They were screamed at, beaten, and spat upon. They were stripped of their civilian clothes, the last remnants of their former lives. Their heads were shaved, removing the dignity of their appearance. They were doused in disinfectant that burned the skin, then thrown into the coarse striped cotton uniforms that offered no protection against the biting Bavarian winds. Ernst was assigned a number. He was given a red triangle to sew onto his uniform, marking him as a Schutzhäftling, a political prisoner. But to the SS guards, he and Max were not just numbers. They were trophies. The camp commandant and the SS officers were ecstatic to have the Habsburg Schweine in their clutches. You must understand the psychology of the SS men. Many were young, radicalized thugs who had been taught that the old monarchy was weak, effeminate, and responsible for Germany's defeat in the First World War. Now, they had the heirs of that empire at their mercy. It was a power trip of the highest order. The abuse began immediately. The brothers were singled out for special treatment. In the twisted logic of the concentration camp, special treatment did not mean better food or a softer bed. It meant the opposite. It meant that when the other prisoners were allowed to rest for a few minutes, Ernst and Max were ordered to perform sport, forced calisthenics, crawling through the mud, jumping jacks until they collapsed, rolling on the gravel until their skin was raw. But the SS had a specific, humiliating task in mind for the sons of the Archduke. They were assigned to the Scheiß Kommando, the latrine detail. This was the lowest, most despised job in the entire camp. There was no modern plumbing in the barracks. Instead, there were massive pits collecting the waste of thousands of men suffering from dysentery and fear. It was the job of the Scheiß Kommando to pump this waste into massive, iron-wheeled wagons, and then pull these wagons, like draft horses, across the camp to the disposal fields. The wagon had a nickname among the prisoners, the Viennese coach. Picture the scene. It is a freezing morning in 1938. The fog is clinging to the parade ground, and there, harnessed to a cart dripping with human filth, are the two nephews of the Emperor Franz Joseph. The guards would gather to watch the spectacle. They would laugh, pointing their whips, shouting, "Look, the royal carriage has arrived." They would mockingly bow as Ernst and Max struggled to pull the heavy load through the muck. "Where is your court now?" they would scream. "Where are your servants?" The physical toll was immense. The wagon was incredibly heavy. Ernst was not a physically imposing man. He was slender, intellectual, and his health had never been robust. The strain of pulling the cart day after day tore at his muscles. The smell was inescapable. It seeped into their skin, their clothes, their very souls. They were covered in filth from dawn until dusk, but the SS's plan to humiliate them backfired in a way they did not expect. The camp was a microcosm of society. It was filled with communists, social democrats, Jews, criminals, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Initially, many of the leftist prisoners, the sworn political enemies of the monarchy, looked at the Hohenberg brothers with suspicion. They viewed them as symbols of the hated feudal past. They expected Ernst and Max to be soft, arrogant, and demanding of privilege. Instead, they saw two men who worked without complaint. They saw Ernst stopping to help a weaker prisoner, even when he was barely standing himself. They saw Max sharing his crust of bread with a starving inmate. They saw the brothers maintaining a quiet, unbreakable dignity amidst the squalor. When the guards knocked Ernst into the filth, he would stand up, wipe his face, and return to the harness without a word of begging. Slowly, a grudging respect began to form. The red prisoners and the black prisoners formed an unlikely alliance. They realized that inside the wire, the old politics didn't matter. There was only the SS versus the rest of them. Ernst became known not as a prince, but as a good comrade. Survivors later recalled that the Hohenberg brothers were among the most decent men in the camp. They never asked for favors. They never tried to use their name to get an easier job. They suffered alongside the lowest of the low. However, the suffering was taking a catastrophic toll on Ernst's body. The starvation diet, watery turnip soup and a slice of sawdust-filled bread, was not enough to sustain a man doing hard labor. He began to waste away. His eyes sank into his skull. His teeth began to loosen. He developed chronic bronchitis from the damp, unheated barracks. There were moments of surreal horror. On one occasion, a high-ranking Nazi official visited the camp. It is rumored to have been Hermann Göring, though accounts vary. Göring had been a guest of Franz Ferdinand before the First World War. He had hunted on the Archduke's estates. He had eaten at their table. Now he walked past the son of his former host, who was standing at attention in a striped uniform, emaciated and covered in sores. Göring looked at him, then looked away. There was no recognition, no mercy. The bond of the old aristocracy had been completely severed by the blade of Nazi ideology. In 1939, just as the Second World War was breaking out, the brothers were transferred to Flossenbürg concentration camp. If Dachau was a purgatory, Flossenbürg was a deeper circle of hell. It was a camp built in a granite quarry. The work there was murderous. Prisoners were forced to carry massive blocks of granite up the steep, slippery slopes of the quarry. If a man stumbled, he would fall, knocking down the men behind him like dominoes, or he would be beaten to death by the capos. It was here that Ernst almost died. The physical exertion of the quarry was too much for his weakened heart. He collapsed multiple times. It was only the fierce protection of his brother Max that saved him. Max, who was stronger, would often try to take the heavier loads. He would shield Ernst during the roll calls, standing close to him to transfer body heat. They were inseparable. The guards tried to separate them, knowing that their bond was their source of strength, but the brothers always found a way back to each other. Back in the outside world, the war that their father's death had triggered was raging again. But in the camps, news was scarce. They heard whispers of German victories, Poland fallen, France conquered. It must have seemed to Ernst that the darkness had won completely. The Habsburg world, the world of order and faith, was gone, replaced by a machine of total brutality. And yet, Ernst found solace in his faith. He was a deeply religious man. In the secret, stolen moments in the barracks at night, he would pray. Not for liberation, perhaps. That seemed too impossible. But for the strength to endure one more day without losing his soul. He prayed for his wife, Marie-Thérèse, and their children, who who were living in constant fear in Vienna, harassed by the Gestapo, stripped of their assets, never knowing if the next telegram would bring news of Ernst's death. As the war turned against Germany in 1943 and 1944, the conditions in the camps deteriorated further. Overcrowding became a crisis. Typhus epidemics swept through the barracks, killing thousands. Ernst, now a skeleton of a man, was transferred back to Dachau. He was placed in the invalid block for a time, a place that was usually a waiting room for the crematorium. It is a miracle that he survived. Perhaps the SS kept him alive as a hostage, a bargaining chip for the end of the war. Or perhaps it was simply luck and the sheer stubborn will of the Habsburg blood. But by the winter of 1944, Ernst was barely recognizable as a human being. He was 40 years old, but he looked 80. He had been imprisoned for nearly 7 years. 7 years of hunger, 7 years of fear, 7 years of smelling death every single day. Then came the spring of 1945. The end was near. The sound of artillery could be heard in the distance. The Americans were coming. The SS guards began to panic. They burned documents. They forced thousands of prisoners on death marches into the mountains to die of exposure. Ernst was too weak to march. He remained in the camp in the chaotic, terrified days of late April. The atmosphere was electric with fear. Rumors flew that the SS planned to bomb the camp and kill everyone before the Allies arrived. Ernst lay in his bunk, listening to the gunfire getting closer, wondering if he would survive to see the sun rise on a world without swastikas. In 1943, perhaps as a calculated political move, or simply because he was physically useless to them, the Nazis released Ernst. He was sent back to Vienna not as a free man, but to live under constant Gestapo surveillance. But the damage was irreversible. The man who returned to Vienna was a ghost. The Ernst who had entered the camps in 1938 had died in the quarry of Flossenburg. Only his shell remained. But freedom is a complex thing when you have been shattered. The Americans found a man who was physically destroyed. The doctors who examined the survivors were horrified by the condition of the prominent prisoners. Ernst's internal organs were damaged from years of starvation. His heart was weak. His nerves were shot. He returned to Vienna, but it was not a triumphant homecoming. Vienna was a ruin. The Stephansdom Cathedral was burning. The city was divided into occupation zones by the victorious Allies. The Russians were in the east, the Americans, British, and French in the west. The Hohenberg Palace had been damaged. Ernst was reunited with Marie-Thérèse and his children. The moment of their reunion is something we can only imagine. The tears, the disbelief, the shock of the children seeing their father so changed. He was alive, yes, but the Ernst who had left in 1938 had died in the quarry of Flossenburg. The man who returned was a survivor, haunted by the ghosts of the millions who didn't make it. He tried to rebuild. He tried to be a father and a husband, but the post-war world had no place for him. The new Austrian Republic was busy trying to distance itself from its Nazi past, claiming to be the first victim of Hitler. There was little sympathy for the monarchists and certainly no talk of restoring the Habsburgs. The confiscation laws that had taken his childhood home in Czechoslovakia remained in force. The new communist government in Prague had no interest in returning castles to princes. Ernst lived for 9 more years. They were years of quiet suffering. He never spoke much about the camps to outsiders. It was too painful, too impossible to explain to someone who hadn't smelled the smoke. He focused on his family, on the small joys of being able to walk down a street without a guard screaming at him. But the damage was done. The latrine detail had done its work. The toxins, the stress, and the malnutrition had planted a ticking clock in his chest. On March 5th, 1954, in Graz, Austria, the clock stopped. Prince Ernst of Hohenberg collapsed and died. The cause was officially heart failure, but let us be clear, it was a delayed execution. The Nazis had killed him. It just took his body 9 years to finally give up the ghost. He was 49 years old. His death went largely unnoticed by the world. The newspapers were full of the Cold War, the hydrogen bomb, the new terrifying standoff between East and West. There was little space for the obituary of a man who represented a dead empire. But consider the arc of this life. It is perhaps the most poignant timeline of the 20th century. 1904, born into the height of imperial splendor, yet excluded from it. 1914, orphaned by the event that destroys the old world. 1918, stripped of his home and country by the birth of the New World. 1938, imprisoned by the totalitarian nightmare that rose from the ashes. 1954, died broken in a world that had forgotten him. Ernst was the ultimate victim of his times. He was a man who never fired a gun, never ordered a battle, never sought power. He just wanted to live in peace with his roses and his family. But history would not let him go. He was tethered to the destiny of Europe by his blood, and he was dragged behind its chariot until he was destroyed. We often look for heroes who conquer, who fight, who win. But there is a different kind of heroism in Ernst's story. The heroism of endurance. The heroism of a man who is handed a bucket of filth by a laughing guard and carries it with his head held high, refusing to let the bastards see him cry. The heroism of holding on to one's humanity when the whole world has become a slaughterhouse. The story of Ernst does not quite end with his final breath in Graz. To truly understand the weight of his life, we must look at what happened after, at the silence that settled over his memory and the physical legacy that remains today. Ernst was buried in the crypt of Artstetten Castle. There is a profound and heartbreaking symmetry to his final resting place. He lies near his parents, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. In life, the rigid protocols of the Viennese court had tried to keep them apart, keeping the royal archduke separate from his unequal wife and children. But in death, at Artstetten, they are finally together, away from the prying eyes of emperors and chamberlains. The crypt is quiet, far removed from the noise of the Sarajevo gunshot and the screams of the Dachau guards. It is a sanctuary of the rejected. But even in death, the politics of the 20th century refused to leave the family alone. For decades after the war, the Hohenberg name remained a complicated burden. In Austria, they were reminders of a lost empire that the modern republic wanted to forget. In the communist bloc, where their beloved home of Konopishte lay behind the Iron Curtain, they were erased entirely. The textbooks in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War barely mentioned the children of Franz Ferdinand. Konopishte became a state museum, a tourist attraction where guides told stories about the Archduke's hunting trophies and his imperialist ambitions, but said little about the 3 orphans who had been kicked out in 1919. The nursery where Ernst had played, the gardens where he had learned to walk, they became public property, stripped of the personal tragedy that had unfolded there. It is only in recent years, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that the full history has begun to be acknowledged. The descendants of Ernst and Max have fought long legal battles, not necessarily to restore the monarchy, but to restore the truth, and in some cases, to seek restitution for the property that was stolen from them not once, but twice, first by the New Republic in 1919, and then by the Nazis in 1938. These legal battles have been largely unsuccessful, blocked by the complex web of post-war treaties and the Beneš decrees. The castle of Konopiste remains the property of the Czech state. The rose gardens are still there, blooming every summer, but they no longer belong to the family that planted them. However, the true legacy of Prince Ernst is not found in bricks and mortar, nor in the legal documents of lost estates. It is found in the character he displayed when the lights of civilization went out. When we look back at the 20th century, we are often overwhelmed by the scale of the suffering. 6 million Jews murdered, millions of soldiers killed in the trenches. The numbers are so vast that they become abstract. We lose the ability to feel them. That is why the story of Ernst is so vital. He allows us to focus the lens of history down to a single human face. He represents a specific individual cost of the era's madness. Think of the journey this one man took. He began his life in the highest circles of the old European aristocracy, a world of candlelight, waltzes, and absolute certainty. He ended it as a survivor of the most industrialized system of cruelty ever invented. He spanned the bridge between the 19th and 20th centuries, and he bore the scars of that transition on his own body. There is a question that hangs over his life, a question that is uncomfortable to ask but necessary to consider. Did he feel the guilt of his name? Ernst was an intelligent, sensitive man. He knew that the bullets that killed his parents were the spark that ignited the First World War. He knew that the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire led to the power vacuum that allowed Hitler to rise. He knew that his family's tragedy was the prologue to the world's nightmare. It would have been easy for him to become bitter. It would have been easy for him to hate the Serbs for the assassination, to hate the Austrians for the exile, to hate the Germans for the camps. But by all accounts, he did not. He did not become a radical. He did not preach vengeance. He did not use his name to rally political hatred. Instead, he chose a quiet dignity. In the camps, he shared his bread. In the post-war years, he focused on his children. He broke the cycle of violence. The son of the assassinated Archduke did not become a killer. He became a man who endured. In the end, the story of Prince Ernst of Hohenberg is a lesson on the fragility of privilege and the resilience of the human spirit. It teaches us that history is not a safe place. It is a storm that can tear the roof off a palace just as easily as it can destroy a cottage. No name, no matter how ancient or powerful, can protect you from the turning of the tide. But it also teaches us that while they can strip you of your titles, they can seize your castles, they can shave your head, and they can force you to drag a cart of filth through the mud. There is one thing they cannot take unless you give it to them: your dignity. Ernst kept his. He carried it through the funeral of 1914, through the exile of 1919, and through the gates of Dachau in 1938. He carried it all the way to the end. So the next time you see that grainy black and white footage of the Archduke and his wife riding in the open car in Sarajevo, the next time you read about the spark that started the Great War, look past the car, look past the assassin, cast your mind to the castle in the distance, to the 10-year-old boy waiting for a telegram that would change the world. Remember him. Remember Prince Ernst, the boy who inherited the apocalypse and the man who refused to let it destroy his soul.